What actually happens when America's booming Silk City comes to a grinding historical halt? Today, we are unpacking one of the most defining and, honestly, dramatic moments in American industrial history. We're talking about an event that pitted rapid technological progress directly against human labor in a way that still resonates deeply with us today.
I mean, really think about that for a second. What happens when 24,000 workers simply fold their arms and bring an entire city to a complete standstill? We are looking at a massive 5-month standoff that took place in 1913 in Paterson, New Jersey. And, this wasn't just some local workplace dispute. This strike captured national attention and drew intense battle lines that ended up challenging the very nature of work, automation, and wealth in the 20th century.
But before we really get into the strike itself, we've got to understand the city. Paterson didn't just happen by accident. It was actually founded on this incredible natural feature, the Great Falls of the Passaic River. This massive 77-foot water drop caught the attention of none other than Alexander Hamilton back in the 1790s. He and his allies formed a corporation to harness this immense water power through a whole series of raceways and canals. I mean, they literally built an industrial city from scratch specifically to drive the machines of American manufacturing.
Now, tracking Paterson's industrial rise, you can see this powerhouse didn't just spring up overnight. Hamilton's society kicked things off in 1792. For decades, Paterson produced everything you can think of, from cotton to Colt revolvers, even steam locomotives. But then, by 1840, silk entered the picture. Protected by high tariffs after the Civil War, Paterson's silk industry absolutely exploded. By the 1880s, the city was producing nearly half of all the silk manufactured in the entire United States. It earned the nationwide nickname Silk City, perfectly positioned right near New York City's fashion markets and fueled by this massive army of skilled immigrant workers. And all of this rapid growth leads us straight into the explosive year of 1913.
To really understand the workers' situation, though, we have to understand the work itself. Working in the silk was grueling. It was exhausting, but it was also highly specialized. The process was broken down into 4 distinct stages. First, you had throwing, twisting delicate fibers into strong threads. Second was dyeing, which was a pretty dangerous job, mostly done by men, dipping threads into massive vats of boiling hot chemicals. Third was weaving, a super intense, high-focus task handling incredibly delicate material. And finally, finishing to prepare the final fabric. Silk is known as the queen of fibers, and it is incredibly fine. Get this, a single pound of raw silk could hold up to 1,500 miles of thread. Just imagine the constant visual strain of monitoring miles of microscopic threads in a deafeningly loud factory for 10 hours a day.
So the really crucial point here is that this wasn't just mindless factory labor. As one silk manufacturer himself actually noted, a worker's hands were their most important asset. A lot of these workers were immigrants from traditional silk centers in Italy, Germany, and England. They brought with them highly specialized skills that had been passed down from their grandparents. They weren't just interchangeable cogs in a machine. They were true craftsmen and craftswomen who understood the unique, delicate characteristics of silk way better than anyone else. Now, what's fascinating is that 2 completely different worlds existed at the exact same time in Silk City. On one end of the spectrum, you had people like Catalina Lambert, a major mill owner. His life was a classic rags-to-riches story. He started working in a mill at age 10 in England, worked 16-hour days, and eventually built himself a spectacular, castle-like mansion called Belle Vista. High up on Garrett Mountain, overlooking the city, he filled his home with 400 paintings, including actual Monets and Renoirs. But then, down below in the valley, you had folks like Pietro Botto, a skilled Italian immigrant weaver. He and his family lived in a modest 6-room house in the suburb of Haledon. Just to make ends meet, his wife Maria had to cook meals for dozens of paying boarders every single Sunday. So you have this immense, towering wealth on the mountain and communal, scraping by survival down below. And well, these 2 worlds finally collided on January 27, 1913. At the modern Henry Doherty plant, management introduced the 4-loom system. The new machines had automatic stops if a thread broke, so Doherty argued that one weaver could now manage 3 or 4 machines instead of the usual 2. He maintained he needed to do this just to compete with low-wage mills down in Pennsylvania. But for the workers, this was a massive stretch-out, literally doubling their workload and stress for the exact same pay. When Doherty refused to back down, 800 weavers walked out. And that localized walkout, it absolutely exploded. Within a month, the broad silk weavers were joined by ribbon weavers and the dye house workers.
Nearly 300 different mills and dye houses were completely shut down. 24,000 men, women, and children joined forces in a massive, industry-wide strike that stopped Silk City dead in its tracks. To manage a strike of this unprecedented scale, the workers called in the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies. They were a militant union with a pretty radical platform for the time. They openly rejected the capitalist system and believed every single worker in an industry, whether skilled or unskilled, regardless of gender or ethnicity, should unite as one. Famous, fiery organizers like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Carlo Tresca, and Big Bill Haywood arrived in Paterson to help organize these dozens of fractured immigrant groups into one incredibly cohesive force. Now, despite their radical reputation, their strategy in Paterson was remarkably disciplined. Big Bill Haywood gave them this brilliant directive: your power is in your folded arms. He told the strikers that they didn't need violence. Simply by withholding their highly skilled labor, they had already killed the mills and stopped the profits. In fact, over 2,000 workers allowed themselves to be peacefully arrested, which completely flooded the local jails and drew intense national media coverage.
Okay, so what exactly did they want? These workers were fighting for demands that were considered incredibly radical for 1913. They wanted the 3 and 4 loom systems totally abolished, wage increases across the board, and an 8-hour workday. And their primary tactic? An absolute ironclad pact that no one would return to work until all the mill owners accepted these terms. To keep morale up, they held massive Sunday rallies. Remember Pietro Botto, the weaver we talked about earlier? Well, the socialist mayor of his suburb, Halidon, allowed the strikers to gather safely outside Paterson's police jurisdiction. Botto's second-story balcony literally became a natural stage where thousands of workers gathered every Sunday to hear the IWW leaders speak and keep their spirits high. The big rallying cry for the IWW was, "Solidarity unconquered, unconquerable." But here's the fascinating irony of the whole situation. The mill owners adopted the exact same tactic. They formed a manufacturers association and swore to stand just as united. The local police, the courts, and the press largely sided with the owners. The owners basically decided their best weapon was simply to wait. They farmed out what little work they could to Pennsylvania, totally refused to negotiate with the union, and just waited for the strikers to run out of food. And unfortunately for the strikers, the strategy of waiting worked. By the end of May, the harsh reality of empty stomachs and crying children began to fracture that unconquerable solidarity. The English-speaking and better-paid workers were actually the first to break ranks and cross the picket lines. By July, the Central Strike Committee had to face reality and voted to endorse shop-by-shop settlements. After 5 agonizing months, the strike collapsed. The owners had officially conceded nothing. The financial toll of this whole standoff was just staggering. We're talking an estimated $5 million in unpaid wages lost by the workers during those 5 months. Families lost their life savings, some faced eviction, and those who stood out as leaders, like Pietro Botto, were blacklisted. They never worked in the Paterson silk industry again. But, and this is a big but, the destruction was entirely mutual. The mill owners lost an estimated $10 million in profits by keeping their factories shut down. Owners like Catalina Lambert were financially devastated. In fact, Lambert had to mortgage his property and auction off his beloved art collection just to survive. Both sides bled heavily in this massive war of attrition. So when the dust finally settled, what was the actual legacy of 1913? Well, the aftermath was highly complex. On paper, sure, the owners won. They officially conceded nothing. However, the workers' fierce resistance actually delayed the multi-loom system. The 2-loom system remained standard in Paterson all the way until 1919. For the IWW, sadly, it was a fatal blow to their influence in the East. For the city of Paterson, the strike accelerated the mill owners' flight to Pennsylvania in search of cheaper, less organized labor. But ultimately, it wasn't just labor disputes that ended Silk City. The invention of artificial silk, or rayon, eventually made these massive silk operations completely obsolete.
Which brings us to a final lingering question, and it's a big one. When modern machinery expands production, who should actually benefit? Back in 1913, the owners believed the new automatic looms were progress, a necessary way to increase productivity and save jobs against competitors. The workers, on the other hand, saw it as an exhausting stretch-out that doubled their labor without sharing any of the financial rewards. As we face our own modern shifts with AI and advanced automation today, it's a question that remains just as provocative and just as unanswered as it was over a century ago in Silk City.